ready.
By popular request today we are doing one of Arcade's most popular rail shooters, and with no doubt clearly inspired with the success of the film Top Gun. We are looking at Afterburner today. Regardless of the version you played, we had many home conversions, many fairly horrendous. The game itself is a high octane shooter with beautiful scrolling, gameplay and amazing colours used. It ran on the Sega X board, which allowed sprite and surface rotation to be as great as it was. Truly an epic game undoubtedly, and simply a wow factor, which Space Harrier did a couple of years prior to this one. I'll be including Afterburner 2 in this video as pretty much the same game. It is argued that in fact, rather than a sequel, it's pretty much a revision or an updated version of the original game, which has a few extra stages added. So starting from worst to best, here we go. The Sega of America 1989 conversion isn't as bad as I thought it might be, but make no doubt about it, that typical beeper sound is there and it's pretty horrendous. We have no sound effects in this version, as you can see and hear. It is very bland. It actually opens up fairly promising with the balls at the intro screen, but then the game begins. There is no feeling of jetting off to start stage 1 at all. This version just makes you watch your Tomcat fly off from the aircraft carrier into the distance. The transitions between stages is fairly basic here too. Instead of each stage merging into each other, this IBM conversion pauses a second to load up the next stage. Something I was expecting with this was to at least fly upside down to avoid missiles, but we don't get that either by the seams of it. Controlling the Tomcat itself isn't too bad, but shooting down enemy planes seems a little bit hit or miss, pun intended. It's hard to say if collision detection is actually any good here, as the enemy planes just seem to move far too fast. Not particularly much better to play than the IBM DOS conversion, but at least with this MSX port it seems to move a little better in terms of frame rates. Music wise it's irritating, but by far an improvement of the DOS game. Talking about music, it's okay whilst it sounded like it's not struggling to output the sound. When too much is going on, such as refueling segments in the game, the music severely suffers with this. Shooting down enemies is a bit of a chore here too for the MSX. The real standout thing here is that all colours seem to look really faded. It's totally bizarre. For the Commodore 64 we had two releases of Afterburner, one for the European market and one for the United States. This is the European version, and yes, it really is as bad as it looks. The stages feel like an eternity to get through. There is no continuity between stages and its transitions. This is using a disc version, and between stages this can be around 10 seconds to load the next parts in. It feels soulless, lifeless, and Activision should have condemned it rather than publish it. This truly is a boring game to play, where the only thing acceptable seems to be the music, in which we can enable or disable it or use sound effects instead, or vice versa. Collision detection is pretty much non-existent here. Enemy sprites, including the players, are a mess. At times, enemy missiles almost looks like tiles, a little like something from a Sega Master System game. Considering the Commodore 64 conversion of Space Harrier wasn't actually that bad, how the hell did this version of Afterburner go so wrong? Now, in terms of gameplay, this ZX Spectrum conversion just didn't look great or really play that well. It's not the colours used, it's just the gameplay itself. Just seemed a little bit forgettable. Everything seemed to move so quickly, and locking onto enemies just seemed all over the place, pretty sporadic. The speed and perception of flying fast is kind of there, but some arcade games just didn't translate this too well with home microcomputers. I wasn't able to get any sound with this version, but from what I've heard on YouTube, the music isn't the best for this platform, but we do have an option to change it to sound effects. We do get a proper takeoff with the ZX Spectrum conversion, which to be fair is quite nice, and the refueling sections are really nicely done too. Was this conversion by Activision, releasing back in 1988, going to be a good version? It opens up just like the arcade game, and to my disappointment, this was actually shockingly bad. We can have music and sound effects here, but whenever shooting missiles, the sound effects truly disables the music, and just seems like the ST cannot handle doing both at once. The truly awful thing with this version is how badly it lags in controlling the Tomcat itself. I honestly thought there was something wrong with my controller, but after watching other videos, it soon became apparent that this was how the game was programmed. It likely is one of the worst ST games I've ever reviewed in this series. If it was smoother and didn't suffer from intense frame drops, I could comment on collision detection, but collision detection in shooting down enemy planes just seemed obsolete with this version. This only ranked here because apart from how bad these conversions have been so far in this video, at least this ST conversion looks a little like the arcade game. Although the American version of Afterburner on the C64 is something of a slight upgrade compared to the European version, this is still a fairly dull game to play. It does have a nice opening to the game, kind of faithful to its source game it is copying, but this version just doesn't really resemble much of the 1987 arcade game. It just feels like a generic Commodore 64 rail shooter. In fact, if I didn't know better, I wouldn't have thought this was Afterburner. It does scroll fairly smoothly and the sprites are cleared up with better visuals than the European version had at the time, but all in all, not particularly a great game, but certainly not the worst in this list. Having played the Atari ST conversion prior to this Amiga version, I was convinced this one would be better. It normally is the way. Amiga or ST normally has a better version than the other platform. What can I say about this Activision 1988 release? Well, just like the Atari ST version, it looks a lot like Afterburner, but plays badly. Sure, frame drops aren't as bad with this Amiga European release, but just plays equally as bad really. Planes zoom in, front, behind, and they just look so bad in terms of scale. Collision detection works when it wants to. One good feature here is the floor area scrolls fairly nicely. Gameplay wise is pretty much non-existent here. I was pleasantly surprised by the Amstrad CPC conversion of Afterburner. This was a fairly good 8-bit computer conversion. Of course, things are missing such as music, and yes, it has a small screen too, but everything is here, and this version even merges from stage to stage, with the exception of briefly loading for the next block of stages. It's really nicely done, it plays well and looks really good too for an 8-bit version. It's not overly pixelated, and as you will see from the gameplay footage, it is as smooth as butter. When aiming and locking into enemy planes, this actually felt really good, and the Tomcat was really responsive to controls. With the awesome ability to fly upside down, this also looked really good with the Amstrad version. It's a shame there isn't any music, but the sound effects aren't too bad at all here. We also get a nice part refueling too. Afterburner for the NES is definitely a challenging version. I did find it a little hard to avoid missiles being launched at me here. Controls on this version aren't wonderful but playable to an extent. The ground area isn't anything too special here like the versions to come in this video. All in all, not bad, just nothing really memorable here. Something that stands out with this 1989 10-gen release is the miniaturized look. Everything just seems much smaller, such as the sprites. This conversion also comes with a fair amount of sprite flickering too. There is no HUD here either, so we cannot see how many missiles we have remaining whilst playing. Yes, just like Commodore 64, the Commodore Amiga had two different versions of Afterburner, and this version released for America had the better version, to be honest. Firstly, sprites coming in on screen from behind actually work and look okay with this conversion, a hell of a lot better than the trash from Activision for the European market. Sega published this in 1989, and yeah, so much better, and at this point I am thinking we are getting there with finding the best versions of this game. This conversion is fairly smooth, and hit collision is pretty good too compared to most other versions so far. Music and sound effects are average, and the scrolling ground with objects we are flying past actually looks pretty authentic where the arcade game is concerned anyways. It's a decent port really, and it actually feels much like we have a challenge on our hands playing this rather than falling asleep with boredom. Afterburner 2 for the Sega Mega Drive is fairly nice to control, but this comes with some problems. Firstly, for a Sega Mega Drive game, this is kind of ugly compared to the arcade game that is copying, which is quite surprising given that the Sega Mega Drive could pull off these type of games really well, such as Space Harrier 2. I noticed whilst playing this version that the ground has got tree sprites while you are flying over sea, and the variation of different objects such as buildings whilst flying over land isn't here. The biggest letdown is actually the music though. It doesn't sound much like the Mega Drive in quality, but really sounds like a really poor version of some really bad MIDI soundtrack. Shooting down enemy planes is pretty bad here too. Collision detection isn't the greatest. At this point, my head is now moving left and right and upside down and turning with the Tomcat every way possible as I dodge enemy fire, which means we are definitely on track now of getting some real decent arcade conversion action. The 1988 Sega conversion is pretty damn spectacular given its 8-bit hardware the coders were working with. Yes, it is a little laggy, but come on, this is a Sega Master System, and to attempt such an advanced game on this system is very ambitious to say the least. The awesome thing with Afterburner here is that if you happen to have an FM unit, you could have played this with enhanced sounds rather than Master System's default sounds. So this can produce some very nice audio sounds, providing you have that FM unit, which is also going to give you voice synth too. This is a challenging version, but a great one. The floor scrolls nicely as we pass bars, and shooting down enemies here is pretty nice too. A nice use of color palette here. This is a nice and bright game. Yes, Sega Master System owners certainly would have loved this port back in the day. Likely one of the Sega Master System's best arcade ports around. Get ready. This is Afterburner 2 for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16, released in 1990 by NEC Avenue. This conversion felt a little sensitive to control in that a slight touch on the D-pad made the Tomcat seem a little out of control, but that was easily a case of just getting used to it. It's not a bad conversion graphically, probably average for a PC Engine game. One issue this game had is the canyon stage. It's kind of blocky and ugly and doesn't seem to look anything else like the other stages in the game. Sound wise, it's nothing groundbreaking. Apart from these minor and nitpicky issues, it looks faithful to the arcade game and plays well provided you adapt to the sensitive controls. The Game Boy Advance had a port of Afterburner in the Sega Arcade gallery, which comprised of a few classic arcade games. This one is difficult for sure. By this point, the Game Boy Advance being a 32-bit portable, to port over Afterburner, which at this point would have been 20 years old, was likely an easy task as technology had come a long way by this point. This is a superb portable release for sure, but must be nitpicky here at this point, and really my only criticism would be the pixelated sprites. But really, this is being really nitpicky, because at some point as we start getting into the better conversions, nitpicking is obviously the way to go. Get ready. The powerhouse of a machine, which is the Sharp X68000, had a release of Afterburner 2 by Dempa back in 1989. I actually played this version with a mouse, and the game looked and played really well. One thing that I wasn't blown away with was the missile trails, the smoke trails that is, as you unleash them into the night stages. Oddly enough, as we take a look at the smoke itself, it kind of looks dotted. Again, this is a case of really extreme nitpicking. Everything else here is pretty much great, including the music and gameplay itself.
Get ready.
The CRI 1989 FM Townsend version is simply awesome. Now that we are getting closer to arcade perfection, we can even see that shooting missiles look so much nicer here with the smoke behind them as you fire them. The gameplay is solid here and the music is awesome too. As you can see here, we truly have some great colours here, which resemble the arcade game much more than previous conversions. Again, this was a job for my head going upside down and left and right. No idea why I do this, but it just comes naturally with games like Afterburner. Everything really is here. Though on a serious note, we have a configuration menu like most FM Towns games where we can actually adjust difficulty levels and disable music and sound effects. One criticism, but nothing too massive, is the load times between stages, which is a few seconds each time, but like I say, that's being extremely nitpicky. This 1995 Sega 32X release, named as Afterburner Complete, is just pure awesome. And of course, at this point with 32X technology whacked on top of a Sega Mega Drive, this delivered big time. A complete full screen and pretty much an arcade perfect port. Something really stood out here was firing missiles during Mission 3. That black sky with the brightness of the smoke just looked amazing, and refueling sections were done really nicely here too. Either I am terribly awful with this game, but I do tend to die a hell of a lot playing this version. Just like the FM Towns conversion, we also have an option menu where we can play with some settings to make it easier or tougher. It's a real shame that the 32X didn't take off, but kind of acted like an experimental stopgap prior to the Sega Saturn releasing. I will mention here that this is or was considered as an upgrade to Afterburner 2 on the Sega Mega Drive. And in first place, I chose the Sega Saturn's conversion. So just like the Game Boy Advance, the Sega Saturn had a compilation in 1996 known as the Sega Ages Volume 2. And this includes a version of Afterburner 2. Easily the next best thing you'll get to the arcade classic, from everything from almost identical colours used, perfect ground sprites and objects to control in the Tomcat itself. This is likely the creme de la creme of Afterburner home conversions. Clearly a passion of Sega to produce one of his classic IPs to perfection for the Sega Saturn. And that's it for my ranking of Afterburner home conversions. So like I said at the beginning of the video, people relentlessly asked for this video. So which version do you think deserved to be in top place? Do you agree with my Sega Saturn pick? And more importantly, which version was you disappointed with back in the day? Or was you lucky enough to have a better version? Anyways, thanks for watching.